All right, so we're going to get started. So, just to introduce you to who is going to be on the webinar today. So, I'm Matt Tonkin, and I am part of the marketing team here at Superior Gloves. So, I work a lot of getting the information out there about safety gloves in particular, how to stay safe while you're working, and a whole bunch of workplace safety things. I'm joined today with Derek Coughlin. He is our key accounts manager for automotive and safety, but he's actually been involved in hand safety for decades. So, Derek, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Decades. I'm not sure if I wanted to say decades, but yes, I've been in the business for quite a long time with Superior Glove for over 10 years. So I've seen a lot and heard a lot, and hopefully some of that information that we've been able to compile throughout those years translate into something helpful for everybody today too. So between Matt and I should be good.
Yeah, so a bit about the format of the webinar. If you have questions during it, there should be a chat box where you can throw your questions into there. And at the end of the presentation, when we sort of get through all our slides, we're going to take the time and answer the questions that have come in. If there's a question we don't know off the top of our heads, we might not answer that right away, but we will get back to you with an answer so that we can help you out there. Besides that, just sort of keep in mind whatever questions come to mind, and we'll go from there. All right, so we're going to start out by talking about the science of staying warm and what it is that's happening to your body when you're cold. So the first thing we'll talk about is homeostasis. So what this is referring to when we're talking about temperature is basically how your body maintains its regular temperature through a lot of different things in different temperature scenarios. So the key things you're going to notice are between when you're really hot in a hot temperature, you're going to start sweating. That's to lower your temperature. And if you're in a cold situation, you're going to start shivering, the idea being to warm you up. This is mostly affected by in these situations, you're also going to have a basal metabolic rate. So this is basically the rate at which your body's just burning calories if you're doing no activity at all. So again, in a hot situation, you're actually going to have a lower rate than in a cold situation. So you're going to be burning less calories at rest in hot versus when you're in cold. Now, this has a big effect on how people are reacting to the cold. So, Derek, can you talk a bit about how different people react to the cold?
Yeah, that's exactly. So if we're talking about people that are sedentary, much like the picture shows, a couch potato, as they would say, obviously you're not going to be at the best possible way of retaining heat. You're going to be sedentary. You're not burning calories. You're not doing anything. But the more active you are, you're definitely going to be burning more calories, which in turn will keep you warmer. But also, there's other few things you have to consider too, and that is age. Older people obviously get colder quicker because of the blood flow in the system obviously is slowing down, and nerves and what have you. But also gender takes an effect on that as well. So generally women tend to be colder than men. In terms of statistics, I don't have an exact statistic, but gender, age is also very important, as we talked about originally. A 20 to 30-year-old or 20 to 40-year-old will be hotter overall than somebody in their 50s plus. So that's something to also consider.
And you can see that in the same exact job, two different people are going to require maybe different types of protection, even though they're in the exact same conditions, just based on their makeup.
Yeah, exactly.
All right, so next we're going to talk about why it's kind of important to understand this and what the complications that come from not protecting yourself properly are.
So the first one, obviously, you want to be comfortable no matter what you're doing. To find comfort is obviously the golden nugget of finding the right glove. So we want to find something that gives you the ability, especially if you're working, ability to do your job comfortably, but also stay warm. But comfort, has a couple of, if you're not comfortable, you could then lead into something like hypothermia if it's going to be too cold. And also, when it comes to hands, you're going to also have the risk of frostbite. So comfort is one part of it, but finding the right materials, and we'll talk about that later on, is going to affect your glove performance as well as even environmental, or even where you are in North America. I find a lot of times in the East Coast, because it's a damper air, you're going to get colder quicker, as opposed to the West Coast, which tends to be drier.
Yeah, and when we're speaking of sort of these three things, obviously we're a glove company, so frostbite's the one that really stands out for us. That's where those digits are most prone to that kind of damage, whereas hypothermia is something that you want to look at for your whole workplace protection environment, type of clothing that you're keeping the internal organs warm with, not just looking at gloves in particular. So this kind of brings us to how we protect from the cold. So how does the insulation work? At its base level, when we're talking about insulation with clothing, you're basically trying to create an air pocket that's going to trap warmth from your body and keep that back against your skin. So if you have very tight gloves, let's say, that don't allow for a lot of air to stay in there, that's when you're not going to get that warmth. So the whole idea is to really create a bit of bulk. You basically can't have an insulated glove that doesn't have some sort of bulk to it. It's just not going to work. That's really what creates the temperature. And that's also what creates a lot of the problems when people are looking for winter gloves, is that they're trying to find something that's going to have great dexterity, lots of movement, doesn't feel like you're wearing a very bulky glove, but it's just not possible.
Right. As an example, if you ever drive by a house in the winter and you see a roof melting with snow on it, obviously the heat is escaping from the house. So there's not enough insulation in that house to keep it in the house. So that's kind of a good analogy if you think about it. So the more insulation, the thicker the insulation in the attic, the warmer the house is going to be. So that's the same thing for gloves. Unfortunately, I know we get asked the question all the time. I want the most dexterity out of a glove, but it has to be super warm as well. Well, I don't think anybody's come up with the perfect solution quite yet. There is different material that we'll talk about as well that will help get you to that area. But again, use the house insulation as an idea of what you're talking about. The more insulation you have in your attic, the better you're going to be for insulation. So same thing for gloves.
And that kind of brings us to how gloves break down in terms of construction when we're building out a winter glove. So Derek, I'll let you run through kind of the core pieces that make up a winter glove.
So when we sell gloves, base layers is pretty important in the way I see it, because you also want to wick moisture from your hands. So let's say you wear a rubber glove in the winter, you're going to sweat if you're working hard on it, and that sweat's going to turn to cold. So you want to be able to wick that moisture from your hand, and that's what the base layers idea is. The second layer would be your middle layer, and that's really your insulation that we're talking about. And that'll determine, this is the kind of thing that you have to think about when you're thinking about winter gloves. What type of middle layer are we going to look for? And we'll go through that later on as well. So that's the insulation in your attics, or as we kind of alluded to earlier, that we got to talk about. And then you have your outer layer. So this would depend on what kind of work you're doing. Like if you're talking about outer layers, we're talking something like leather. We're talking about maybe a rubber coating. It all really depends on what you're doing. There also could be a fourth layer in there too, and some of our new gloves will have it, and that's basically a waterproof layer. That would help out in winter gloves overall too, but we can talk about that a little bit later too.
Yeah, I think you made a good point, Derek, when talking about the base layer and that water wicking, and it goes back to what we were talking about before with the base metabolic rate, and for instance, sweating when you're too hot. So one of the big problems with winter gloves is getting a glove that's actually too insulated and too protected, because then your hands start to sweat. And as good as any glove might be at wicking that sweat away, if it's too hot in there, you're actually doing some sort of working towards the opposite of what you want to do, because your hands are going to get wet. And then when they do get exposed to that cold air, that's when the coldness is going to come through.
Yeah, my son went through that with skiing. He wore these gloves and he was very active in skiing, but the gloves were too hot for him, so he was sweating. And when he took them off for just a minute to do up his skis and what have you, put them back on, his hands wouldn't get warm again because of that moisture around his hands.
So this kind of leads us into choosing the actual best winter glove for your uses. And I think the first thing that you're going to have to do is consider the job right there.
Yeah, absolutely. So, this is where we talk about dexterity or what kind of coatings, the outer layer you need. Do you need cut resistance in your winter gloves? What type of insulation do you need, or how warm do you get? And again, we talked about the BMR, all the other factors that play into as well. The environmental, where you are, maybe in the country, and what have you. So these are all questions that a good glove company will ask you before you're ready to buy, for sure.
Yeah, and this is why it's so hard to give a sort of broad use case recommendation of a winter glove, because every job's so different. And then you also take in the factors that we talked about earlier with different ages, different genders,
yeah.
different activity levels, and it really becomes a very tailored option for people using the glove.
Not that it's the hardest thing in the world, but because once you understand like what we talked about with the 3 layers, it's easy to navigate. But as Matt was saying, these are all the things you have to consider, before you go into it.
Anyway, once you've got the idea behind sort of what the job you're going to be trying to do is, you sort of have to look at what makeup of glove is going to work best for that. And that starts with looking at the insulated material.
Right. So this is the middle layer that we were talking about in terms of our gloves. So the cotton flannel would be something that we have in a lot of probably our least expensive gloves, or something that needs, they have maybe some dexterity, or not a very cold environment, that's for sure. That's really just going to wick the moisture from your hands, but also it'll retain a little bit of heat. Nothing below 0 for sure is something that I wouldn't recommend the cotton flannel for. The secondary ones that we saw a lot of is the BOA acrylic. Now, this is something that if I go back to what I was saying about my son, he had this kind of insulation in his ski gloves, and he was very, very active. So it's very warm, so he was sweating a little bit, but they're also bulkier. And that's the problem with the BOA construction. There's a lot of air in the BOA acrylic, and that's where it keeps the warmth. The third option would be the Thin Slate. This is by 3M. It's kind of really your premium insulation. It kind of gives you a little bit of a best of both worlds. It gets the thin feeling of the cotton flannel, but also gives the warmth of the BOA without having the bulk, and it's definitely warmer than the cotton flannel. So it's definitely going to be more expensive. And if you're somebody that's working outside, let's say like linesmen's and what have you, this is something that is highly recommended. And I think we have this in pretty much all of our linesmen's glove, any of the Thin Slate products. And the Thin Slate products also are in different thicknesses as well. So we have some that protect up to -50 or down to -50, I guess you could say. And then we have some that, hit, at the 0 mark. So it's kind of all over the board, but generally the Thin Slate is definitely has the most options and the bigger pick for what people might need.
It's interesting that you said even with Thin Slate, which is really going to be the most warmth for bulk level, to get additional warmth out of it, you're going with thicker levels of it. There's no way around it.
No way around it.
Bulking up is going to be what keeps you warm.
I mean, some people, what they do is they add a thin liner, and I've done that before in the past. Is that there's a microfiber thin layer of glove that you can put underneath. So you figure between that glove and then the existing glove, you've got an extra layer of air, which again adds a little bit of more bulk, but it also adds more warmth too. So especially if you're going to have to take bulk your glove off to do a job, then that might be a good alternative as well. So have a thin, warm layer that's going to, keep some heat in you while you take the glove off to do those really fine motor skills that you might need to, in your job. So
the next part considering is going to be sort of the style and the material of the glove, talking about mostly the rest of the construction outside the insulated pieces.
Yeah, so we kind of talked about this a little bit earlier. So if I look at a leather glove, maybe as insulation, with insulation in it. The leather is actually going to probably keep the wind off a little better as well. As you can see, maybe some of the red products there, the coating is maybe a 3/4, so the back of the hand might get, some wind through, some wind getting through the glove, which in turn will help, it will make you a little cooler. So this is a good smattering of what we're talking about in terms of, something that's a base warmth to something that's higher, that's better in really cold environments. And then if you're talking about cut resistant, if you need it, or then you can also get into a mitt versus a glove, and that's something that I'm sure everybody's aware of. A mitt's going to be definitely warmer because you have all 5 fingers, giving off heat into one area, as opposed to 5 fingers insulating each finger. So that's the gist of that as well.
Yeah, there's always those trade-offs in terms of flexibility, things like that. But yeah, this where all that protection that we also boast about, our cut protection, our abrasion resistance, that's all going to come into the outer construction of the glove, and different liners that are specifically built to protect for that in both summer gloves and winter gloves.
I mean, if you can get away with a mitt, I mean, that's going to be your warmest option, that's for sure. But let's put it this way, I got to think most people can't get away with a mitt in their jobs. Yeah. They need to be able to have some fine motor skills for sure.
So that brings us to the fit, and this is probably a really important piece of how a glove is going to keep you warm, because if you screw up the fit of the glove, it's going to affect it a lot.
Yeah, I mean, if I look at shoes as an example too, if you fit a shoe too tight, you're going to sweat more. So a fit in a glove is very similar too. So you need to have some air flowing through that glove to give your body's natural heat the ability to sink into the glove to retain heat, essentially. So you also got to think about how far the wrist protection you need up. So if let's say you're reaching up over your head quite a bit, is that glove gonna pull down and give your, open up your skin to, frostbite or some sort of cold. So these are all things you have to consider as well. The design of the glove, the fit of the glove, how much airflow you have through the glove, they're all kind of important parts.
Yeah. So we're showing you a few examples of winter gloves we have here. And these aren't examples that we mean to specifically suggest for you. Again, really need to take into consideration everything about the job you're looking to protect against to really have a good example. What we want to show you here is sort of the variety that we have available and that winter gloves can come in, and what those can protect against.
Yeah. And I think, again, you have to look at, if we look at the blue glove, for instance, the NE230, that's a waterproof glove. So that's going to be used, if you need waterproof in your job as well, that's another question we should be asking as well. How important is to keep that water off your hands? If you're not in a water susceptible type of job, then you can get away with not having it. So, leather gloves obviously are going to keep the wind chill off better. Some of the open fiber gloves, with the coatings they're good for better dexterity. So you see there's a bit of a smattering all throughout. And then you have our Snow 322L, which is very bulky, but super warm.
Yeah, exactly. And the type of temperatures that these are going to protect against are vastly different. That Snow 322L that Derek just mentioned is really for the coldest of the cold. You can see there, it's we call it the claw, where your index and middle finger and your ring and pinky are together in individual chambers. Now, obviously, that's not going to be too useful for a lot of jobs out there. It's a very limited group of people that are really going to need that in your minus 40s, minus 50s. So the average person is going to be looking for something that offers a lot more movement.
With that claw, we're trying to cut that line between a mitt and a 5-finger glove a little bit to give it a little more dexterity. Somebody digging, with a shovel or something like that. The claw would be kind of something to consider. It's not a mitt, it's not a 5-finger, but it's kind of in between. So we try to walk that line a little bit with that particular glove. So it's kind of interesting.
All right. So that's the wrap for the presentation portion of the webinar. Now we're going to get into some of the questions that have been coming in. Derek and I will sort of back and forth on this. Again, if we have a question that comes in and we don't know the answer, we will get back to you. We might just take some time to make sure we research that properly. So the big one to start, and I think we've been talking about it a lot, but is there any good option for for jobs that are really going to need a lot of dexterity, but also are cold?
Well, that is the question we get asked all the time. That's the $1,000,000 question. And if we had a glove that gave them, a glove that you can pick up a fine screw with and also give warmth in -50, please let us know too, because nothing's come up at that point yet. But you can always find a nice, maybe an option that as close as possible with a coating that has some warmth to it as well. So obviously, like we said earlier, the thinner, the less heat you're going to retain. So
another big question, is there a standardized rating system for cold resistant gloves?
We have a standard. We've put standards on our gloves. We've put ratings on all our gloves in terms of what the ratings that they're averaged out to be protected to. And again, if we go back to gender, we go back to age, we go back to activity, no activity. It's just a guideline of what to follow. So there's nothing that's stipulated that says gloves have to follow this structure, but we're not the only ones, of course, that do it, but that's something that we do with all our winter gloves. We put a rating on it just to give it a baseline of what to look for.
We offer a lot of different protection when it comes to our gloves. Is it hard to find winter gloves with that protection? So I'm guessing examples would be cut, puncture protection, impact resistance, things like that.
Well, I mean, as the years go on, we've added to our line quite a bit. I mean, I can only talk about our line, obviously, but we have added quite a bit of winter products that allow for the different types of jobs to be accommodated. So if you have impact problems, you're smashing your hand, you're rolling cylinders, we have added new winter gloves to accommodate that. That's for sure. So we probably have something for everybody, that's for sure. But
so if you're working and your hands do get wet, is there really any fix for that?
Well, the only way, and what you have to get out of the cold first of all if you can. You have to dry your hands off, change your gloves, because if you try to put that glove back on, it's frozen. So you're not going to do yourself any good. You're going to run the risk of frostbite. So you need to dry your hands and then getting in a new pair of warm gloves in order to warm them up. That's for sure.
So we've got a specific question for high vis gloves, road crews or any situation that are going to be high vis. Do we offer them gloves like that?
Yeah, again, styles.
Yeah.
In terms of how warmth is gonna, if there's a specific glove for that industry, no, because again, there's all the different factors. But yeah, I mean, we have stuff with high vis on it. That's for sure.
Removing gloves, putting them on and off. Is there a big risk to that?
Absolutely. Yeah, you don't want to allow that cold inside the glove. That's for sure. So the longer you keep the glove on, I think you're better off. That's for sure. Unless you can get into an area that's nice and cool, nice and warm, so you don't have an issue like that.
Looks like we're having a lot of questions about liners. Maybe that's something we can talk a bit more about, just to give an example of what we mean when we're talking about liners versus all one-piece gloves.
So one of the liners that we have, it's basically a thinner version of insulation. So basically, it holds air, much like insulation in your house, and it's a 13 gauge shell, so it's very thin. But you would put it underneath your other gloves. So this gentleman asked that he wears mitts and what have you. So the liner could go underneath the mitt, add that much more air protection and that much more heat to the gloves, and also wick the moisture. So some people use polypropylene, which would allow the moisture to wick from your hands as well. But also with our particular glove, we just have more air in it. So it's just adding a thin layer of air more to the glove, which would bump up the heat protection for sure.
We have a question here about putting your gloves in the oven to warm them up. I would think that really depends on the situation. If you're talking about after, say, getting wet, well, you're kind of just heating up the moisture, and eventually it's going to cool down again, and you're going to have that wetness on your hand. If you just want to heat them up before going outside, keep in mind that then that's hotter than your body temperature, and that goes back to what we were talking about at the start of the webinar. the metabolic rate and how your body reacts. So if your hands are hot, your body's going to react by sweating. And then that sweat, your glove might wick it away a bit, but eventually it's going to saturate the glove. And when that heat from the oven goes away, you're going to be left with a cold, wet glove.
That is a good point. And also you got to think about what type of gloves you're talking about. If you're putting a leather glove in a stove, you're going to destroy that glove. You're going to dry it right out. And so with gloves, if they get wet, we recommend just letting them air dry. I wouldn't put them in a dryer. I wouldn't necessarily put them on the vent in the house, or if you have an indirect something that directs the air differently into the gloves. I know there's something you put on top of the vent I've seen at different stores. That tends to be probably a little better, but you need to let the glove dry naturally, not dry the heck out of the glove, because you're just going to destroy it.
Yeah, I guess it comes down to maybe it's a good idea to have an extra pair on hand for those situations where you
absolutely. That's a good point. Yeah.
We have a question about specific types of leather in winter gloves. Is there going to be a difference between, say, a pigskin and a cowhide?
Well, I mean, pigskin is probably definitely your least. It's not going to be as durable, that's for sure. It's thinner, but cowhide it would all depend on the type of job you're doing too. If you're digging ditches, pigskin's not going to be the way to go. Cowhide is definitely the way to go. If you need dexterity and you're not really hard on the abrasion side of the level, the pigskin will work, no problem. So it all really depends on your job. Goat skin we sell a lot of. We find that goat skins, the durability in goat skin is very, very high. It's probably 2 or 3 times higher than just even cowhide. So again, that's for somebody that's hard on their gloves.
What would you suggest for someone looking for winter gloves that are going to also have a good grip?
Look at the coatings, but also you got to factor in what type of coating. If you're looking at, let's say, a nitrile type glove, some of our winter gloves have nitrile in it. They'll freeze up quicker at a temperature than, let's say, maybe a PVC would. A PVC will stay more flexible.
What would you suggest when it comes to laundering winter gloves?
Well, we talked about that a little bit earlier. Definitely, if you're going to launder them, warm water, not hot water, and also low heat dry. That is, and least amount of chemicals as possible. Sometimes you get into winter gloves that have Gore-Tex liners in it. You got to be careful with. You've also got the BOA lining in some of the gloves. If you hit it with too much heat, you might start melting stuff. Who knows, right? So the good rule of thumb is, and this is something that I would say, like 105 wash, 105 dry. Excuse me.
We have a question specifically about cryogenic gloves and whether that's part of our lineup.
Yeah, we had a great glove too in the years past, but we've since updated it, and it's been a great glove for that particular industry. And that's something that, if you want to reach out to us, we can send you information on that as well. It's pretty specific, so we do have gloves for that type of application for sure.
Yeah, and that the interesting thing about cryogenic gloves brings up another use case in terms of duration of time spent in colder or short versus long cryogenic. You're probably going to be shorter periods of intense cold versus, say, being outside at a -5 degree day.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, you're going in, you're getting some product coming out, but the material itself is freezing cold too. So
we've had a fairly specific question here about gloves for linesmen, in particular wearing gloves under a rubber insulator and what consideration they might need to take into.
Yeah, I mean, the linemen are always those guys are they got a tough job, that's for sure, and I empathize with them for sure. So in terms of wearing something underneath one of the insulating gloves, you got to be very careful when it comes to that. So you just got to make sure that you don't impact. Obviously, the safety is important, especially with the lions. You got to make sure that you're safe and make sure that it meets all the criteria that your company puts out.
We've had a few other questions about touchscreen compatible gloves coming up when you're working with a screen but also need to protect your hands from the cold. Is that something that's available in a winter glove?
Sorry, say it again.
Touchscreen compatible winter gloves. that's something that's available?
Yeah, I mean, I see that a lot. I mean, if we go back to even the ski wear stuff, you see that it's coming more and more prevalent these days, especially as, as the younger generation comes into the workforce and they're used to their use of their phones and what have you. So they need to have that capability for sure. So yes, we have that ability, not in all of our gloves, but a good chunk of them. And every year it seems to get more and more.
Yeah, and I think that's just another one of those features where it's all about trying to fit everything in. Sometimes there's going to have to be some give or take. So you might not be able to get a touchscreen glove that's going to protect you down to -50, but at the same time, it's all about what that job really needs.
Yeah, you just want to make sure you're warm. That's it.
We have a question about heaters in gloves. So I'm not really sure exactly about this. Maybe you have a bit more experience with that.
Yeah, I'm sure that's the one where you open the package and you put it inside your palm and it keeps heat for 8 hours or 6 hours. Yeah, I mean they're good for those people that are in really, really cold weather or that don't have that BMR rate that you need to keep warm. But again, we go back to over warmth and making it sweaty. The good thing about those things, though, they continue the warmth throughout. It's not like heating your glove up in an oven like the question was before, and then it goes away. That continues to generate heat over and over and over and over again. So I think it's definitely a good option if you can fit in your glove. And if you're in that kind of cold weather, so like a linesman would, I know a few guys wear those that I deal with.
Yeah, I guess it all comes down to making sure that the heat source isn't going away. And that's where you get into a problem where you're fine, you have the heat source, and then suddenly the cold comes in and starts to slowly go away. And then next thing you know, you've got just sort of a wet hand that is getting cold.
Yep.
All right. Well, I think that's all the questions we've had in today. If you have any more, we will be doing a follow-up that has a recording of the webinar. So you'll be able to share it with people as well. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach back out. If you have specific glove case needs, we do have people that can help you find the right glove for your use case.